We are going to be able to regrow limbs. We'll be able to use a person's own cells to do it. There's so many potential beneficial uses of genetic engineering, I wouldn't even know where to start. But I'm concerned with some applications of genetic engineering that either through accident or misunderstanding or evil intent could do something potentially harmful.
You mentioned stem cells.
Fetal stem cells are cells that were obtained from embryos. Massive problem. Moral dilemmas everywhere you look on that issue.
The ethical dilemmas, especially for Christians, how do we handle those?
I like to divide it into three categories. The first one is, so following Jesus' example, if we can use genetic engineering to improve human life, that's not a bad thing.
How far are we away from cloning? When I think about genetic engineering, I like the good, like insulin for diabetics, but what about the scary parts, like potentially designer babies? With these benefits come some ethical dilemmas for Christians. So how do Christians handle this? Dr. Carter, you have something to bring to this issue because you teach about genetics and you even hold a couple of patents in this area. So before we jump into this, let's start at the beginning. What is genetic engineering?
Well, quite simply, genetic engineering is the deliberate changing of the DNA of some organism. But there's different types of genetic engineering, different moral issues that come up, and some of them don't have a problem, some of them might. Like, for instance, we might want to fix a genetic defect. Just taking a single letter of a genome of some organism and changing it to put it back to the way it was before. So we know that's a mutation, maybe, hereditary blindness or hip dysplasia in dogs or whatever it might be. We know what the original is. We just want to fix it back. That's one set of experiments. Another type of genetic engineering might be adding something to a genome that doesn't currently exist. Let's say that I have a strain of tomato that I really like and I want to bring it to market, but it bruises really easily, so I can't ship it. But I know there's other types of tomatoes that don't bruise easily. And we know what gene that is. We know what the genetic change is in that tomato that allows them to ship. Why can't I just take my strain of tomatoes and engineer it today with that thing that already exists in tomatoes? It's not anything new, but it is new for that strain. Now I could, breed tomatoes together over many, many, many years and constantly refine it until I got something that looks like the strain that I really like with that sweetness and that tartness and the ability to ship, but that might take 100 years. So genetic engineering allows us to do it today. What would happen naturally?
So it's a cheat.
It's a cheat, yeah.
Okay.
Third type of genetic engineering, though, that's where all the issues come up, most of the issues, is when you take DNA from one organism and engineer it into another organism. It's called transgenics.
Okay, so is this technology of genetic engineering, is it different than any other technological innovation in history?
Not really, because everything humans have ever done comes with good and bad. I mean, someone invented an axe that you can use to chop down a tree. You can also use it to chop down your neighbor. And so anything can be used for good or ill. And people being complex and sinful beings, we can do good and do bad with the same technology. And genetic engineering is neutral in that regard. I'm not afraid of genetic engineering itself. I'm concerned with some applications of genetic engineering that either through accident or misunderstanding or evil intent could do something potentially harmful.
All right, so you're bringing us to the focus point of our discussion today, which is going to be about the ethical dilemmas, especially for Christians, and how do we handle those? Yeah. Where do we draw the line? So where do we draw the line?
The Christian approach that I take to this, I like to divide it into three categories. The first one is quite simple, the line. We should not be experimenting on other human beings. Humans, according to the Bible, are created in the image of God. We have something no other thing in creation has. We have the ability to know God, to relate to God, to wonder about God. That we're different than all animals. We're certainly different than bacteria and fungi and things like that. So humans are the pinnacle of God's creation. We're the focal point of his plan of salvation, and all, it's all this theological and metaphysical sorts of stuff wrapped up in just being a human. So we should not be experimenting on humans. That's the first level. After that, I'm going to apply something that's called the dominion mandate. That is, in the Garden of Eden, God was talking to Adam and Eve, and he gave them dominion over the birds and the fish and the animals and other things on land. Basically, he said, take care of my creation. And part of taking care of creation is trying to fix things that are broken. And that definitely applies, genetic engineering definitely applies to that. So if we can properly understand our role in God's created world, then genetic engineering might have a place in that role, as long as we're not breaking the thought that humans are made in the image of God. The third, when Jesus was on this planet, he healed a lot of people, and people blessed him for that. Likewise, today you have doctors, and doctors' job is to actually reverse the effects of the curse. They help people. They cure diseases, they prolong life, they make our lives better and more comfortable. And people love doctors because of that. So following Jesus' example, if we can use genetic engineering to improve human life, that's not a bad thing. There are still some huge ethical considerations, which we're going to get to, but those are my three criteria that I use to separate the issues. And if as long as all those things are being fulfilled, then and not broken and not contradicted, then genetic engineering should be okay to apply.
All right, so let me pose a scenario to you,
Okay.
and that will help us understand where the limit is. So, for example, could we use an octopus gene to regrow a human arm?
Oh boy.
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview because we will be offering an exclusive free stream of our award-winning documentary, Evolution's Achilles Heels. You won't want to miss it.
Okay, no today. But in the future, maybe we could. So let's just say that we learn enough about the regeneration of some organism like an octopus that can regrow something, and we stitch that gene into a human being. Yeah, that doesn't seem appropriate. But there's a difference between an adult human and an embryo. Because an adult human at least has the ability to give consent. Say, yes, I agree to this, or no, I don't agree to this. And yes, I understand the risks. A little baby does not. So we can already separate it from, babies in the womb, infants, embryos, and adult humans. Yet, we are going to be able to regrow limbs. Not as in, if I lose my arm, I can regrow an arm. What we're going to be able to do in the not too distant future is build bones as a scaffold, muscles, glue the muscles on, grow skin, grow nerves, and assemble it together into an arm. At least that's the goal.
Like that would happen in a lab somewhere and it would be transferred, or?
Something like that. And we'll be able to use a person's own cells to do it, to regrow body parts. I mean, it's on the horizon. People are working really hard on that. Maybe not something as complicated as an arm, because there's a lot of different tissue types, but a bone, skin, all sorts of things like that. We're right on the verge of doing that.
Okay, you mentioned stem cells. So
Yes.
Is there a moral use of stem cells currently? And if so, did we just put an expiration date on morality?
Ooh. Yes and no, because stem cells come in two different types. Adult stem cells, I have very little qualms about experimenting with adult stem cells. I mean, if there was a place where some scientists needed a cell line, I would happily donate, some bone marrow or some skin or the end of my fingernail or whatever they might want. Here, take my cells. For privacy reasons, I might not do that, but for moral reasons, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Something right now is a cure for sickle cell anemia. And what they're experimenting on is sampling a person's bone marrow, then giving leukemia drugs to kill off their bone marrow, then taking the bone marrow in the laboratory and changing the DNA so those cells no longer have the sickle cell gene and putting it back into the person.
But adults
Adults
who can give consent.
who can give consent and understand the risks. They might die from it. They might not die from it. They might get cured. But it's a really interesting thing. That's also not something that can be passed on to the next generation.
So if someone who did have sickle cell and they had this procedure and they were cured, potentially they could still genetically pass that along to offspring.
Yes, because in this case, it would only be changing the bone marrow cells, not the reproductive cells. But that's also a line we should draw as far as genetic engineering. If we ever genetically engineer humans, I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but morally, there's less problems with it than with babies. We have to be really careful to not affect what's called the germ line. That's the reproductive cells, because genetic engineering is risky. And if you make a mistake and that mistake is inherited, you've just affected the baby and maybe the grandchildren, maybe the great-grandchildren. You might have caused a defect that's now being passed along in some family line that wasn't there originally. So most ethicists in the world say, do not experiment on the germline.
Because the future risks are unknown. So
Because the future risks
could be
are unknown, yes.
some unintended consequences.
Yeah, and unintended consequences are one of my main concerns with genetic engineering. And it's not, yeah, there are evil people in the world and people have done horrible, evil things in history. I know that. But it's the accidental things I'm more worried about. And there's a lot of genetic engineered organisms that have been released into the environment. Okay, fine. But one day, what if we invent a new crop that they start planting all across Iowa, and it's like a major migratory path of a species of bird or butterfly, and it's toxic and they all die? That's the kind of accident that's typical for a human to make. This is why we have laws about this, and why we do testing in the laboratory before we put it out. We don't do small scale testing after we put it out. So far, a giant ecological catastrophe has not happened so far.
A lot of people are tentative about genetic engineering.
Oh, yeah.
So do we need to be afraid?
Well, again, it depends. And part of this discussion is educating ourselves so we understand what's going on. The problem is that genetic engineering is already affecting most every aspect of our daily lives. Medicines, medical procedures. The clothes that we're wearing, these dyes have been tested for safety on genetically modified organisms. It's in genetic modifications is in the production line of almost all of our foods. And even if something's like, no GMO, that doesn't mean that some genetic modified something isn't in the production line, safety testing or an ingredient that they might add to something. It's everywhere.
Yeah, you mentioned several things that I want to talk about, that our clothes have been impacted by genetic engineering. And then you mentioned GMO foods, how much of that is just an advertising gimmick?
As far as being afraid of it?
Right.
A lot of suspicion because of misunderstanding and miseducation. The thing is, we've been consuming GMOs now for decades. Most people don't even realize it. And our health hasn't declined. There might be some people who are sensitive to something, but statistically you can't detect it. So it's not, and plus let's say you have a strawberry and you want to engineer that strawberry with a banana gene because it does something to strawberry to make it something for the production line, right? Well, you can eat a banana. You can eat a strawberry. You just added something that already exists in nature that people are already consuming and putting into a new thing. There's nothing new there. There's no inherent risk of adding a banana gene to a strawberry. So and plus I'm like, the first time you ate corn, you ate probably millions of proteins your body had never seen before. And genetic engineering is essentially, when you change a gene, you're changing the proteins. Or when you add a gene to something, you're adding a protein gene. So it's just a protein that we eat all the time. And so the first time you ate corn, you had millions of new proteins your body had never seen before, and you just digested them away. So if you genetically modify an organism with new protein, it's just a protein. It shouldn't be toxic. It shouldn't be bad for you. But it doesn't mean it's always true. Just saying.
So can you give us some good examples of how genetic engineering can be applied? You mentioned earlier about insulin, or we talked earlier about insulin for diabetics. What are
Yeah.
some other good uses?
Oh man, there's so many examples. I hardly even know where to start. So let's just give you one example. In my work, during my dissertation, my doctoral work, I took genes out of corals and I engineered them into fish, and I made bright green and bright red fish. So that was a neat trick, but the goal of the laboratory was to get that gene expressed only when the fish had cancer. So if we can get that gene next to a gene that turns on when the fish had cancer, the tumor would be green or red. And then we cured it, it wouldn't be green or red anymore. That's a very powerful application. Now, I left, they hadn't quite gotten there yet, but people are experimenting on these sorts of things all over the place, all the time. There's so many potential applications. I mean, in medicines, a lot of the things we genetically engineer an E. coli or a yeast to produce a medicine in vast quantities. And so you had this giant vat of bubbling sugar and bacteria, and then you boil it down, and there's your medicine in the water. You can harvest it, purify it, and then we have something to use. Stuff like that is all over the place and happens all the time.
So it's really hard to avoid any kind of genetic engineering, typically in our daily lives.
It's difficult to avoid it, yes.
All right, so I want to segue into something a little more heavy, if you will. I want to talk about the role of fetal stem cells in genetic engineering.
Okay.
So what are the fetal stem cells?
Fetal stem cells are cells that were obtained from embryos, mouse embryos or human embryos or any number of other species, but it's really human ones I think you're asking about.
Yes.
So these cells can be obtained from an abortion, and then the embryo or the little baby can be dissected and cells can be removed. A lot of them now come from the in vitro fertilization clinic industry. Leftover embryos will be sold or transferred to either a government lab or a private institution that works on the cells. Honestly, I don't have many qualms about adult stem cell research. It's the fetal stem cell research that raises almost all of the moral problems.
Because you mentioned they can come from abortions.
Yes.
Or from leftover IVF.
Yes.
So let's
and that breaks that first rule that we set up in the beginning, saying the first point is that human life is sacred. Humans are created in the image of God. We are special. We have a spirit within us, and we don't have the right to, kill other human beings. And life starts at conception. Biologically, scientifically, logically, biblically, life starts at conception. So an embryo is a little human being.
So that does pose the moral dilemma for Christians when we're reaping something that had its origins in fetal stem cells that were obtained from abortion.
Yes, but once you learn something, you can't unlearn it. Once something has, some dastardly deed was done in the 1950s, well, we might still be benefiting it from today. We can't undo it. But through education, through better scientific understanding, we can at least advocate for the future that, some things are stopped or not repeated, even though there was a famous cell line derived from an abortion in the 1950s that was used to develop the polio vaccines that saved millions of lives. Now, my mother didn't know where that vaccine came from. I think she would have had a big problem had she known. But millions of lives were still saved. In the 1970s, another cell line was developed in Holland at the University of Leiden, actually, in a specific laboratory. And it was an abortion that was scheduled so the laboratory would be ready. And this is before abortion was legal in the Netherlands also. The only out clause was for a threat to the life of the mother. But it was a well-developed child who had developed kidneys. And so the HEK, the human embryonic kidney cell line, that's been used a lot over the last 30, 40, 50 years, was developed from that incident. I have a friend who's a cancer researcher. He actually works on childhood cancers. Curing childhood cancers is a noble goal, a wonderful profession to be in, but he's using HEK 293 and he knows it. But he said, Rob, I have nothing else to use. I can't undo what happened back in 1971, 72, but I can use them today to save children's lives.
So it would almost be like taking money from a bank robbery and giving it to a charity.
Yes, very much like that. But it's a position we shouldn't be in, right? Because I'm not the bank robber, but I'm still benefiting from that deed. And so are all of us. So all we can say is, Christians should be advocating for certain things. And most of us aren't even aware of the issue, so we can't say anything. We don't know what's going on. But once we know what's going on, say, oh, here's something that's good, here's something that's bad, and we should be able to try to separate them.
Well, something that was in the news several months ago in the area of IVF, one of the major denominations really brought up the issue, the problem of these numerous embryos that are human life, these babies that are just frozen and kind of in limbo here to what to do with them. And they were advocating adopting these. They're called snowflake babies, right?
Snowflake babies, yes.
So,
I know several snowflake babies.
Do you?
In fact, I know a woman who's only a couple of years older than her daughter because her daughter was frozen for like 20 years.
That's just mind-blowing to think about that.
Yeah. One of the issues is, though, just because an embryo has been frozen doesn't mean it can survive for a long time. There's a shelf life, if I could use a crass term for a human baby. They don't last forever. And yet there are many, many of them out there. Now, the technologies have gotten better. They don't create as many embryos as they used to because the success rate is much higher. And so there's not as many leftovers as there was. But again, what are we supposed to do? This should not exist. And yet we're stuck with this. And now people trying to advocating for adopting frozen embryos, but not all of them can be adopted. It depends on the permission that the mother signed. Some of them are slated to be sold or given to private clinics. I mean, Harvard has a massive stem cell thing, and it's independent of the government also.
And these would be obtained from embryos?
Yeah, usually IVF clinics instead of abortions, because that's more difficult. The U.S. government, I don't know about other governments around the world, the U.S. government has a list. It used to be 4, now it's over 600 or 700 now, of approved cell lines, embryonic cell lines that were obtained using various methods that a researcher can apply for federal funds and use those cell lines. But the private laboratories, which there are many, especially at the large universities, they don't necessarily use federal funding, and they can use a lot of other cell lines that we don't necessarily even know about.
Well, speaking of what we don't know about, we really don't know about any potential issues that some of these frozen embryos might have later on. Yeah,
IVF is not neutral. In fact, we have an article on creation.com. It's been there for decades. Carl Whelan wrote a long time ago about in vitro fertilization. And after he and I were talking, that article got modified because IVF children have a higher rate of a very specific class of developmental issues. It's not guaranteed, and other non-IVF children have it also. Just there's a higher risk. It's not a zero risk thing because you're taking an egg out of a mother and putting it in a dish in a laboratory. Well, that egg is living, and it's going to have to change what genes are being expressed as stress responses. And so you have now stressed this egg, then you're going to fertilize it and put it back in a mother, and hopefully it takes, but it's been artificially manipulated. And that's not even talking about the genetic modification of humans, because now if you're going to add something to try to change the DNA of that egg cell, it's really going to go through a lot of stress. And therefore, I suspect that if we try to genetically modify embryos, we're going to be creating a class of humans with a much higher risk factor for a specific set of genetic defects or developmental abnormalities.
So more unintended consequences.
More unintended consequences. So when the IVF industry started, what was the first test tube baby? 1978 or something like that. I mean, you and I were little. We weren't paying attention to science or politics, but I remember seeing, like Life magazine or Time magazine at the grocery store, the test tube baby, and there's this huge uproar and all this argument and all this debate, but it's routine now. Hundreds of thousands of people.
There was a
maybe
stigma
more
at
than
the
that.
time.
There was a huge stigma, yeah, and everyone's wondering what they're going to grow up like. Well, most of them grow up perfectly normal because they're little babies and little human beings, and God made eggs to grow, or fertilized eggs to grow into things like you and me. But there's still a risk associated with it. It's not zero, and so we need to be very careful.
Hope you're enjoying this interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly. But real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We host close to 1,000 events each year, and our experienced and accredited speakers come to you without charging a set speaking fee. They deliver engaging, illustrated, and impactful presentations covering a range of topics dealing with the creation and evolution debate. We've received thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through CMI's speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today. Thanks again for watching. So you were talking about genetic engineering. So tell us a little bit, how exactly do you genetically engineer something?
Oh man, there's all sorts of different ways. For my work, I started with a coral that I pulled out of my saltwater fish tank, and I would grind it up. And I extracted the RNA out of the coral, and I converted that RNA into DNA. And then I mixed that in with a solution of E. coli bacteria, and I electrocuted the bacteria. And we sent a lightning spark through it, kapow, it popped. And then I would take those bacteria that had been electrocuted, because when you run electricity through the bacteria, they open their pores up and they suck in DNA. So now I have coral DNA inside bacteria. And I'd spread them on a plate, put them in the incubator overnight. Next morning, I'd open up the thing, I'd look at it, and every once in a while there'd be a green or a red, maybe a yellow colony, because the green fluorescent or the red fluorescent protein from the coral is now in the bacteria. So it's one way to do it, electrocute bacteria. But then what we would do is we'd grow a big vat of this bacteria of green or red, and we'd split the cells open and run it in the centrifuge and pellet out the bacteria, and then take the DNA and cut it with some bacterial enzymes, which are probably grown in genetically modified bacteria, and that would cut the gene back out again. And then we'd add it to a piece of DNA that's designed to go into a fish. And we use other bacterial enzymes to join that DNA together, and then we would take fish eggs that are newly fertilized and under a microscope, put them into a pipette and just inject them into the fish eggs. Stab, 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 and inject the DNA from the coral that was in the bacteria into the fish.
You sound like a mad scientist.
It was mad science, and it was amazing science. Just to be able to do that, to make transgenic organisms. Yeah, to make the Frankenfish I've been accused of. But it was fun. That's only one way to do it, or two ways to do it.
Well, speaking of being a mad scientist, how far are we away from cloning?
Cloning is trivial. We can clone dogs, we can clone horses, we can clone all sorts of animals routinely. I read, several years ago, I read a story of a Japanese scientist who had cloned a rat 17 generations in a row. Same rat, he just kept on cloning it. And the last rat was as healthy as the first one, he claimed.
He would almost know to the day how old that rat was going to be, how long they would live if it was the same rat.
It was genetically identical to the original, but it was a normal looking rat. So cloning is routine, but you're not asking me about cloning. You're asking me about human cloning. Okay, massive problem. I mean, moral dilemmas everywhere you look on that issue. But consider that identical twins are clones. One way we learned, 1800s, you could take a sea urchin egg and split it, and then split them and split them. You can make a whole bunch of sea urchins from one single fertilized egg. That's what a twin is. It's an embryo that is...
A sea urchin?
Well, that's what a human twin is you take the embryo, or the embryo splits in half, and now you have two little babies. You can get quadruplets that way. That get extremely rare after that. There's one thing in the legal system here, though. Scientists aren't allowed to experiment on an embryo after 18 days.
What happens after
Well,
then?
after the 18-day window, that's when the spinal cord starts to develop, and you can no longer split the embryo and make twins. So twinning has to happen before that, left-right diversification and the spinal cord starts growing. There are some people that are actually not happy with that. They say, this is arbitrary. Why can't I experiment on something after that? Well, I'm pretty certain that a lot of people have. It's just they can't report on it. Because, why go climb Mount Everest? Because it's there. Why go to the moon? Because it's there. Why not experiment further with these embryos? I can learn stuff. In fact, they might be able to learn things that they can retroactively now do in the earlier stages. And so, again, there's good and bad, and humans can be good, humans can be bad, and humans can be just short-sighted. So genetic engineering itself is not evil. And the potential has a huge amount of good. It's just that people can be evil, and that's the problem, is you add people to it.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of different things regarding, from cloning to GMO foods. We've covered a lot of material. Remind everyone about some of these guiding principles, in particular, because you mentioned that there's so much that goes on. There's legal ramifications, but of course, there are the moral dilemmas. And you even talked about how much of this that we encounter in our daily lives. Your mother, for example, with the polio vaccine, we don't even know that we're dealing with genetic engineering. So let's go back and get some guiding principles to help.
Okay. For those guiding principles, we're going to go back to what we said at the very beginning of our conversation. But let me give you another example, and then let's throw it into those three categories to see if it matches.
Okay.
Some scientists have genetically engineered a cow to produce spider silk in the milk.
What?
Now, it's not like a Spider-Man cow, flying across the city with her udder. No, it's just the proteins.
That's just weird.
It is totally weird, but it produces the proteins that can be assembled together to make spider silk. That is amazing. Spider silk has so many potential industrial applications. And from bulletproof vests to, buildings that are as light as a feather and stronger than steel. I mean, there's all sorts of potential applications for spider silk if we can produce it on an industrial scale. So is this good or bad? Should we have done this or not? Well, what's the first thing that we talked about?
Made in God's image.
Humans are made in God's image. A cow isn't. It's a cow. Now, I do not want animals to suffer needlessly. I don't think that's glorifying to God, but it's not a human being. Second, the dominion mandate. We have been given control over this earth while we're here. God basically said, okay, humans, take care of my earth. And so as good stewards, we should be trying to take care of his earth. Okay. But if the cow is not being harmed, if it's not suffering, it might be happy, has its own little pasture, gets milked a couple of times a day. Some people say, oh, we shouldn't be eating animals and all that. Okay, that's a whole nother issue. But in general, the cow can live a happy, robust, happy if it's a cow, but a robust, fulfilled, long, disease, stress-free life. That's not bad. And the third issue is, what if we can use that spider silk to, say, heal burn victims? Or fix wounds, or maybe a prosthetic arm for a baby or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of very beneficial possible uses for that. So I know it sounds creepy. Absolutely creepiest thing you can imagine, a spider silk producing cow. What? But then again, it could have really good potential uses, and it might fit under our guidelines or biblical guidelines of how to deal with this. That's very different than embryonic stem cell research and genetic modification of human beings. So we need to separate that in order to really understand what's happening.
Rob, these are some great pointers for people to try and navigate some of the ethical dilemmas that we encounter on a daily life. But if someone wants to know more, what would you suggest?
I would tell them just go to creation.com. And in the search box, type in IVF, type in cloning, human cloning, stem cells, any one of those sorts of phrases. We've written a lot of articles on these topics over the last 20 years or more. We've been writing. Just great information there, but we're also doing it from a scientific and biblical standpoint, not from an evolutionary standpoint. And we're, showing Christians here's what the issues are. Here's how to think through them. Here are the implications of some of the stuff. And, sometimes when you do that, it's like, oh, that wasn't a big deal. Other times you're like, oh, this is a very big deal. So that's how we approach it, very scientifically. So speaking of science advocacy, I am very excited to offer something to our viewers for free. This is Evolution's Achilles Heels. This is my baby. I spent 3 years working on this, and our team spent 3 years on this. We interviewed a number of PhD scientists who are also Bible believers, and we asked them a simple question. The question was, in your area of expertise, what can evolution not answer? And they said the most incredible things. We call them Evolution's Achilles Heels. We talk about natural selection, genetics, the rock record, the fossil record, radiometric dating, the Big Bang. But we end up with a section on ethics, which is really an opportunity now to talk about the gospel. So we're trying to use science to introduce people to Jesus Christ and the way that they too can go to heaven, because we see that, the belief in evolution, millions of years, but evolution specifically, is one of the primary reasons why people reject the claims of Christ. And that's why we do what we do.
We'll make it available in the description. Thanks so much for all your help today, Rob.
You're welcome, Dawn.